Thank you so much for your time today. It's great to be with you in Michigan.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good to have you here.
So in your prepared remarks today, you are expected to say, trying to urge people to resist the politics of personality. Are you referring to your former boss there?
Well, I joined the Republican Party in the days of Ronald Reagan. And I really believe that the conservative movement has always been animated by ideas. We've had big personalities, from Reagan all the way to Donald Trump. But I think it's the ideas, a commitment to a strong national defense, fiscal responsibility, limited government, and traditional values that really, I think, created this movement in many ways, and I think they still sustain it. And so I'll say to these young people here in Michigan today that they should resist the temptation of focusing on personalities or embracing a populism unmoored to conservative principle. And that the challenges that we face in this country today, whether it be Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, a menacing actions by China in the Asia Pacific, or a mountain range of debt, all require leadership that is grounded in principle and in experience. And I want to encourage these young people, many of whom I think will pursue careers in public life, to build those careers on timeless American principles.
I mean, a lot of the things that you're talking about when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to entitlement reform, when it comes to kind of taking down the temperature in politics, as you say, it seems like you want to reflect a pre-Trump Republican Party.
Well, I think I just want to be true to my calling in public life. I wrote a book recently, Caitlin, in which I talked about my early days in politics, where I got caught up in a couple of very negative campaigns. And as a Christian, I came to regret that and felt very strongly that campaigns ought to first demonstrate the basic decency of the candidate, and secondly, they ought to be about issues that are more important than your own election. And in all my years in Congress, my years as governor, and in my service as Vice President of the United States, I tried to live up to that standard, however imperfectly. But as I've traveled around the country, I've heard again and again that people look at the record of the Trump-Pence administration. They want to get back to our policies of a strong defense, American leadership in the world, a vibrant free market economy, secure borders, and conservative judges. But I also hear that they want to see us get back to the kind of civility in politics that the American people show each other every day.
You mentioned that you have some regrets about negative campaigns in the past. Would that include while you were campaigning with Trump?
No, I'm speaking about my early days in politics. I allowed myself my ambition to overtake what my faith and my values taught me to live out every day. I just think negative personal attacks have no place in public life, and I've embraced that principle over the past 20 years. But I must tell you, for me to have had the opportunity to run and to serve as Vice President of the United States was a great honor. Obviously, the administration did not end well, and I've written and spoken about that very plainly. But the record itself, the opportunity to have played some small role in strengthening our nation, having America standing tall in the world, reviving our economy, securing our border, and appointing 3 of the justices that gave America a new beginning on the right to life has been a great privilege in my life.
You see that as an achievement?
All of what we did during the Trump-Pence administration, I think, left America and our liberties stronger and more secure. And over the last 2 years, seeing the way American credibility has eroded on the world stage in the wake of the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, seeing the runaway spending in Washington, D.C. that's launched the worst inflation in 40 years and what appears to be a steady assault on values and liberties. Like most Americans, I long for the policies of the Trump-Pence administration, and whatever the future holds for me and my family, we'll continue to fight for those values.
I do want to ask about entitlement reform, because you have been out there advocating for some reforms to Medicare and Social Security. You have Republican leaders on Capitol Hill saying they don't want to touch it. Are they wrong?
Caitlin, we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy today, and that's unsustainable. And for President Joe Biden, his policy is insolvency. And if we don't address the issue of entitlement reform and Social Security and Medicare in a compassionate, common sense, responsible way that doesn't impact anybody at the point of the need, doesn't even have to impact Americans that are going to retire in the next 20 years, but sets it on a more sustainable fiscal foundation, we're going to pile on those 3 granddaughters of mine and the next generation of Americans a mountain range of debt that if we wait 25 years to deal with it, the American people will only be faced with bad choices. So I want to stipulate that the decision by Speaker McCarthy to keep Social Security and Medicare out of the debate over the debt ceiling negotiations, I think is the right decision. It's too large of an issue to deal with in that single issue. But we need to produce national leadership that can be straight with the American people, explain the magnitude of the debt crisis that we are facing in this country, and offer the kind of common sense, responsible reforms that I think would be broadly acceptable to the American people today. If we fail to do that, I think we'll fail those granddaughters of mine. I think we'll fail future generations, and we'll set America on a path for a debt crisis the likes of which the world has never seen.
So is it fair to say that if you do run for president, entitlement reform will be a key part of your platform?
Well, my wife and I are continuing to give prayerful consideration to entering the race for the Republican nomination for president. But I can assure you that if we choose to run, we'll bring that broad conservative agenda that's characterized my life and my career to the fore. That means a strong national defense. It means standing up for America's place as leader of the free world, confronting aggression, whether it's in Eastern Europe or standing strong in the Asia Pacific. But yes, it also means promoting policies that will get the economy growing again, but also advancing policies that will set our national budget on a sustainable pathway. I must say, the American people have a demonstrated ability to do hard things. But it's only been at those times in our history when we've had leaders that were willing to be straight with the American people, tell them what the real challenges are, what the solutions are. And if I'm called into that contest, I'll speak just that way.
So on entitlements, do you think that Republicans should take this head on?
Well, I think it requires presidential leadership. And Joe Biden's policy is insolvency. Literally to ignore a looming debt crisis for this country that is driven by Social Security and Medicare, I think is unconscionable. But so long as the president is failing to lead on that issue, I think Republicans should make it clear that while it's not in the debt ceiling negotiations, that they're open to responsible and compassionate reforms of entitlements down the road. But I really do believe it's ultimately going to take presidential leadership to set our nation back on a path of fiscal solvency.
I want to switch gears a little bit, staying on Capitol Hill. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is releasing video of January 6th, the attack on the Capitol, to Tucker Carlson. Is that a wise move?
Well, I believe in the public's right to know. And I support Speaker McCarthy's transparency with the American people. I was there at the Capitol on January 6th. It was a tragic day. I think that the American people, as we learn the lessons of that day, the American people would benefit to know what occurred, the whole range of what occurred, but also understand some of what's been recently reported about the failings of the intelligence community to convey information, to properly prepare. Whatever we learn from January 6th, we just have to internalize those lessons and make sure that it never happens again.
Are you concerned, however, that by releasing this video to Fox News, that it might there might be an effort to kind of distort what happened that day or downplay what happened that day?
Well, I trust the American people will be able to sort out the facts, but I've been a champion throughout my career of the public's right to know, and the more information the American people can have, about what happened on that day, I think the better. It's one of the reasons in the last several months I've spoken very openly about it. I've written extensively about my experiences that day. January 6th was a day of tragedy, but it became a triumph of freedom as the elected representatives of the American people, thanks to the courage of law enforcement, were able to reconvene the very same day and complete our work under the Constitution of the United States.
I want to get to a little more of that in a moment, but there were new court documents that show that some Fox News hosts were knowingly promoting false information about the election. Does that concern you?
I don't know anything about it any more than what Americans have read in the papers, but look, I'm a big believer in the Fourth Estate. I don't always like what's reported in the press, but I like a free and independent press, and I think we should always err on the side of the First Amendment. Even
when there is false information that is not true?
Well, I would leave the facts to speak for themselves, but as I said, I more often than not don't like the treatment in the press. Didn't like it much during the Trump-Pence years in most quarters, but I'll always stand for a free and independent press.
I want to ask about this special counsel wanting you to testify. How far are you willing to go to defy that subpoena?
Well, let me say, as I made clear several weeks ago, that the notion of compelling a former vice president to appear in court to testify against the president with whom they served is unprecedented, but I also believe it's unconstitutional. And I'm limited in what I can say about those proceedings at this point in time, but people can be confident that we're going to do as we've always done, as we did in January 2021. We're going to stand on the plain language of the Constitution of the United States and take that matter into court.
Judge Ludwig, who you sought counsel from on January 6th, he says that you don't have a constitutional case to make.
Well, I'm very confident. I'm very confident in the counsel that we've received, scholars that have spoken about that. But again, I'm limited in what I can say about it, Caitlin, other than to say, I felt my duty was clear on January 6th to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and I think this principle of separation of powers is just as important, and we'll stand on that principle.
On that note, you have been adamant and proud of how you handled yourself on January 6th. So why characterize the criminal investigation into what happened that day and the efforts to overturn the election as political? I mean, doesn't that kind of run counter to the argument that you've been making?
Well, I don't know that I've ever characterized it one way or the other, Caitlin. I've said that it's important that we stand on the Constitution of the United States, the separation of powers, the duties that I discharged that day. But I'm very confident the courts will sort that out. And but that being said, the very idea of an investigation now 2 years in the making, I just hope the Justice Department thinks very carefully about the way forward, and I hope and pray they will.
Going back to what you mentioned a little while ago, that you and your family are considering a potential presidential run. You have said by the spring you'll make a decision. What is left to consider here?
Well, Ronald Reagan said memorably that the American people have a funny way of letting you know if they want you to run for president. And over the last 2 years, I've traveled to some 35 states, and we're going to continue to travel, continue to listen, and my wife and I will be making a decision, I'm sure by the spring, about what our intentions are. But I'm very confident that we'll have a clear sense of our calling by that time.
Can you give us a percentage of kind of where you think you are when it comes to making that decision?
Look, I love this country, and I think this country's in a lot of trouble. And what we're trying to discern is whether or not our background, our experience in the Congress as a governor, as Vice President of the United States, our dedication to the broad-based conservative agenda to meet those challenges is right for the moment. But you know, I've said for many years, I think there's two kinds of people in politics. There's people that are driven, and people that are called. And candidly, Caitlin, I've been both. But over the last 20 years, my wife and I have always tried to reflect, to listen, have a sense of calling, and I'm sure we'll be clear on that by the spring, and I promise to keep you posted.
I hope you do. As you've been traveling around, are you, more incentivized to run from what you're hearing?
We've been very encouraged as we've traveled around the country. I've been humbled by the response of my book, So Help Me God. And you know, for a small town guy from southern Indiana whose biggest dream was just to be the congressman from his hometown, it's deeply humbling to have people speak to you about seeking the highest office in the land. And we cherish that encouragement, and we'll continue to listen and continue to take it to heart. And we'll have some decision, I'm sure, in a timely way this spring. And
as you consider kind of where you fit into this potential field, where does Mike Pence fit in? What is the constituency? I mean, you have to acknowledge that there is a strong base of support for the former president. As you know from what you saw on January 6th, there are, a significant portion of the base that is upset with how you handled that day. Is there any ability to move those voters?
Well, I just have great confidence in the American people. I don't think anyone could have defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 other than Donald Trump. And I didn't realize that initially. I supported another candidate in the Indiana primary. Mm-hmm. But Donald Trump offered a change of leadership and the kind of campaign that was able to take on a Clinton campaign machine that was decades in the making. And I think Republican voters chose wisely. And I'm just very confident that Republican voters will choose wisely again. I think they'll look at the challenges facing our nation, and they'll look at the men and women that have stepped forward to vie for that nomination. And I'm confident our standard bearer will carry the day in the fall of 2024.
If that standard bearer is the former president, if he is the nominee, would you support him?
Well, I think we'll have better choices, and I really trust Republican voters to sort it out. Again, I'm very proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. I think no one could have defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 other than Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. But I think different times call for different leadership. And everywhere I've gone the last 2 years, I've heard over and over again people's gratitude for the record of the Trump-Pence administration, but a genuine desire to see us produce the kind of leadership that practices politics the way the American people deal with one another. I mean, the people in this country get along pretty well in the main. We have diverse views. It's a great big country, but Americans demonstrate respect and civility to their neighbors and friends at work, at worship, every day. And I think they long for leadership in this country that's as good as our people, that will treat one another the way they want to be treated. And I think that's what I hear people looking for today.
That's not a yes in terms of supporting Trump if he's the nominee.
I'm very confident we'll have better choices come 2024, and I'm confident our standard bearer will win the day in November of that year.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has a new book out where he's talking about what he believes are achievements and how he handled COVID in his state. I know as vice president in the Trump administration, you were overseeing the administration's response. Is Governor DeSantis's characterization of how he handled COVID in Florida, is that a correct one?
I'm incredibly proud of what the American people accomplished during the worst pandemic in 100 years. When I was tapped to lead the White House Coronavirus Task Force at the end of February, we hadn't had a single American fatality and only a small number of cases in the country. But soon the pandemic struck, and we launched a whole of government, a whole of America response. We reinvented testing from a standing start. We saw to the delivery and creation of billions of medical supplies, and of course the development of several safe and effective vaccines by the end of the year. Governors were our full partners in that process, and frankly, I'll always be grateful for what many of America's governors did during those difficult days, and the way they worked not only to put the health of their citizens first, but also to open up the economy as quickly as we could. So I think we have a lot to learn from those days. I think we should learn those lessons, but I'm incredibly proud of what the American people accomplished.
And Nikki Haley has advocated for a competency test for president depending on age. She said it should be 75. Do you agree with that?
Well, I come from southern Indiana, where people think most politicians should have a competency test. So,
so you would agree?
No, look,
or some kind of age limit for presidency.
No, I think the American people can sort that out. I really do. I mean, the long and unbroken history of this country proves again and again the wisdom and common sense and judgment of the American people. And I'm confident, and as I'll say here to these Michigan students today, that on that foundation of American common sense, the best days for this country are yet to come.
And are you confident that President Biden is up to the task mentally and physically?
My problems with President Biden are the failures of his policies at home and abroad. I think this administration has weakened America's place in the world. I think that the dismantling what we had accomplished on the southern border has created the worst crisis in history. Runaway spending has driven the worst inflation in 40 years, and on one policy after another, I think the Biden administration has failed the American people, and that's why this moment calls for new leadership.
But you don't have any concerns about his age, his mental fitness, his physical fitness?
My problems with President Biden are all the failed policies at home and abroad.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We appreciate your time very much.
Thank you.